My name is Sunny Desai. I'm the supervising attorney of the Administrative Law Unit at Maryland Legal Aid's Baltimore City office. So I do a lot of public benefits, a lot of unemployment law, along with some of my colleagues. Let me try to share my screen here just so we can get started. Okay, so what I want to discuss is some of the changes that have been made to the unemployment law. However, in order to discuss those, I'll give a brief background on the existing unemployment law. So unemployment benefits are designed for folks who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. So layoffs, firings that are not their fault. There's a lot of requirements under traditional unemployment law that I'll go over quickly, but a lot of those don't apply under the new changes. I'll highlight those as we go. So under traditional unemployment law, you have to be an employee of a covered employer. So you can't be an independent contractor, you can't be self-employed, you can't be a church employee, and there's several other examples. You also have to have a base period of eligibility. What that generally means is you have to have worked for the last year, last 4 quarters. There's also some non-monetary eligibility criteria. You have to be able and available to work. You have to actively seek work. You can't be discharged for misconduct. You have to accept suitable employment when offered. So that's a quick overview of traditional unemployment law. So now let's get into some of the changes that were made at the state level, and this is Maryland-specific changes. So unemployment benefits are now available to folks if their employment has been affected due to the COVID-19 emergency. So if your employer has temporarily ceased operations, they haven't told you one way or the other whether or not you're let go. They just have stopped, perhaps because there's a state mandate that non-essential businesses close. Then you may be eligible for unemployment benefits. You likely are eligible for unemployment benefits. If you have to quarantine, or if you simply don't want to go into work because you don't want to risk getting infected by COVID-19. If you have to stay at home to care for a family member, these are all reasons that you may be eligible for unemployment benefits that was not the case previously, but these are new changes that have been implemented. Also, there's no requirement, if it's a COVID-19 related reason, there's no requirement that you've quit or you've been fired. Even if you still have employment, when this crisis is over, you're able to go back to work without losing your job. While you're staying at home, you can still get unemployment benefits right now. And finally, an employee cannot be terminated if they're required to be isolated or quarantined while we're in this state of emergency. So these are all expansions of the unemployment benefits that did not exist, but have been implemented currently. So now I want to get into some of the federal bills that have passed, and you may have heard about some of these bills. They're passing them in bits and pieces. The Family First Coronavirus Response Act was phase 2, as they call it, the second federal bill that was passed to respond to the crisis. So as far as unemployment, the bill covers a lot of different things, but as far as unemployment is concerned, they're adding $1 billion to the state's coffers to help with unemployment and administration of unemployment benefits. They're also providing interest-free loans to pay benefits through the end of this year. And if the state reaches 10% unemployment, they receive 100% of the benefits are covered by the federal government. Before it was a 50-50 partnership. And maybe most crucially for claimants, they're requiring that the state suspend work search requirements. So under traditional unemployment law, you would have to actively seek work, but because of the new federal legislation that's passed, in Maryland, they're suspending the work search requirements for 10 weeks. And that might get extended, we're not sure. Additionally, they're also expanding the good cause exceptions for leaving work. So under traditional unemployment, if you simply quit your job, you likely weren't eligible for employment. But now, if you're leaving work because you're, for example, you don't want to contract COVID-19, that might now be a valid reason to leave work and then to receive unemployment benefits. I say might, and I'm saying maybe for a lot of these things because we're still waiting for firm guidance from some of the federal agencies that administer these programs that has not been released yet. Phase 3, the third bill that was passed by the federal government, Congress, was Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or better known as CARES Act. This is the most recent bill that was passed last week. And what this covers, this greatly expands the unemployment program. In addition to traditional unemployment, they're now created additional categories. The first program I want to talk about is pandemic unemployment compensation. And all of these benefits have acronyms, and they all sort of sound alike. So if you aren't quite familiar with what I'm talking about, maybe we can refer back to these slides later on. But the first one, the PUC, is a flat $600 per week benefit that's added to your existing unemployment benefits. So if you apply right now, you start getting benefits, perhaps you're getting $200 or $300 a week. This program will add another $600 on top of that per week through July 31st, 2020. And that's available to all applicants. Everyone who qualifies for employment also gets this $600. And that $600 is not considered income, so it won't affect your eligibility with Medicaid or CHIP specifically. We're not sure about the other programs yet. We're waiting for guidance. The next program is Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, or PEUC. What this does is extends unemployment benefits by 13 weeks. So in Maryland currently, folks are eligible for 26 weeks of benefits. Because of this legislation, that's been extended an additional 13 weeks. The language says that during those 13 weeks, you're required to actively look for work, but there's also language that says that states can be flexible. So for example, if we still have a stay-at-home order, that prevents folks from going out and looking for work, that's likely going to excuse folks from looking for work under this law. There's also other provisions that say states aren't allowed to decrease benefits. That's really, in my opinion, geared towards some of the states that sort of mess with unemployment benefits. Maryland, fortunately, is not one of those states. So this law also waives a 1-week waiting period. Maryland's never had this 1-week waiting period, so it really doesn't apply to us. And then the last and perhaps the most significant expansion of unemployment benefits is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA. This program is modeled after the Disaster Unemployment Assistance Program. So for states that have experienced hurricanes or other major disasters, they have a similar program already in place. So what this does is, even if you're not eligible for traditional unemployment, you will be likely eligible for PUA. So if you're an independent contractor, if you're self-employed, if you don't have the 1-year work history, if you're a church employee, most likely, you will be eligible for PUA. The unemployment, however, must be a result of the COVID-19 emergency. You will be eligible for 39 weeks of benefits. The minimum benefit amount, the national average will be about $190. In Maryland, we're probably looking at closer to $175. But the good news is the $600 per week, you're also eligible for that. So probably be $175 or so plus $600, at least through July 31st. If you're receiving paid leave, however, you're not eligible for this program. Undocumented workers, unfortunately, are also not eligible. But if you do have work authorization, you should be eligible for this program. So that's kind of a quick overview of the expansion of the unemployment benefits, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
My name is Matt Hill. I'm an attorney at Public Justice Center, and I'm going to talk a little bit about housing rights, specifically mostly for renters in the COVID-19 crisis. and we'll do this in a frequently asked questions sort of format. So the most common question we've gotten so far is, can the landlord evict me from my home during the COVID-19 crisis? And the answer is no. So the Court of Appeals has placed a hold on all residential eviction orders, residential eviction cases, residential foreclosures, tax sale foreclosure cases. Landlords can still file a new case, but those cases are paused. So the clerk will take the filing and it's essentially on hold until the court lifts this kind of stay or pause. And so if you're, the best way to find out about when this stay is going to lift and when the eviction cases will resume is the court's website, which has its own coronavirus page. So what if you can't pay your rent next month, or at this point this month, due to COVID-19? Again, landlords can still file a case, but it's not going to be heard yet. And it won't be heard again until the Court of Appeals lifts the pause on all eviction cases. The governor has also signed an executive order that during the emergency, if you're a tenant and you have a loss of income related to COVID-19, or you have health issues related to COVID-19, then in certain eviction actions, you can have a defense. In other words, a landlord can't evict you if your loss of income. And then, as Sonny was talking about, the federal CARES Act says that, and this is the most recent, sort of referred to as a stimulus bill that just passed through Congress. If your property has federal assistance or a federally backed mortgage, so commonly some sort of Section 8 assistance, a mortgage that's owned by Freddie or Fannie, or has an FHA-backed loan, which is about 70% of single-family housing and much of the multifamily housing too. The landlord cannot file a new rent-based eviction case or charge fees, so late fees related to non-payment of rent, until July 25th. So what does all this mean? I think I do want to encourage folks who are facing this issue that you may want to communicate with your landlord, negotiate with your landlord, understand your rights, but it's never a bad idea to open that line of communication with the landlord. And if you come to some sort of agreement, like a payment plan, you want to get that agreement in, oh, that's right, you're all mute. Writing, you want to get the agreement in writing. It's very important, because otherwise, I can't tell you how many of my clients think they have an agreement with the landlord and then find out in court later that the landlord claims they don't have any clue what my client's talking about. If you're looking for financial assistance to help pay the rent, I think the most up-to-date, easily accessible source is going to be calling 211. It's a hotline run by the United Way. And the resources that are available, new resources are coming online. We expect some federal money to come online to help with eviction prevention. That's not happened yet, but the money was allocated in the CARES Act, and we expect that to happen relatively soon. And so 211 should have the most up-to-date list of resources for your particular area. So what if the landlord just ignores what the court and the governor have said and decides to change the locks or shuts off your electricity? Well, that's illegal. If the landlord's beating on your door, you should call 911. Get the police involved. If you find out that you are illegally evicted or your utilities are shut off, you should seek legal counsel and consider filing a civil complaint. If you want to get back in the house, it'll need to be filed as an emergency complaint, because right now the courts are effectively closed except for hearing emergency complaints. You want to keep track of any expenses like a hotel bill or lost property. And in Baltimore City, it's a criminal offense as well. You can go to the district court commissioner and essentially ask the state's attorney to press charges against the landlord. Often what I've seen is that if you do press charges against the landlord is like, oh my goodness, I'm facing criminal liability now. I better let you back into the property. Another note is that the governor has ordered no utility shutoffs through May 1, 2020. So regardless of a landlord illegally shutting off we had somebody call today who lived in the third floor apartment, and the landlord had access to the utilities on the first floor. And so BGE didn't cut off the electricity, but the landlord did, to effectively try to get rid of the tenant. But to be clear, BGE is not allowed to do any sort of utility shut off for any reason, at least through May 1. What happens when the pause on evictions is lifted? For cases that haven't been heard yet, you're going to get a new trial date from the court. As I said before, there may be certain defenses available based on loss of income or health issues related to COVID-19. You definitely want to keep all communications with your landlord in writing, either through email, letters, even text messages are helpful. And so what about an existing eviction order, a warrant that's already been issued prior to the pause on all evictions? The sheriffs are going to go ahead and schedule those evictions once the pause has been lifted. You may or may not get additional notice of that eviction date. So again, it's very important to pay attention to when the court's going to lift the stay. And if you want further advice on whether or not you're going to likely get an additional notice, you're welcome to give us a call at Public Justice Center. We can analyze your situation a little bit more. If you live in subsidized housing and you want to recertify your income or need to report a change in income, remember, if you're losing your job and you're losing that income, it's very important that you report that change of income as soon as possible so that they can then effectively lower your rent. The HUD is encouraging landlords to allow tenants to make those reports on changes of income or recertifications by phone or some other sort of remote meeting. The HUD has even given landlords the authority to delay income recertifications if you're unable to access phone, or you have some sort of fear of exposure to COVID-19 based on your situation. But if your income is reduced, then you want to put it in writing, email, text, leave a note. If you have a housing choice voucher, Section 8 voucher, you want to call or email the housing authority again as soon as possible to report the loss of income and provide whatever documentation of that they're going to require. Should your landlord be doing anything to prevent the spread of COVID-19? Yes. Landlords can impose certain screening of visitors and limitations on visitors, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Closing common areas, limiting gatherings, and having more cleanings of touch points such as elevator button entry doors. Encouraging your landlord, if they're not already taking those steps. Those are best practices recommended by HUD and even the landlord associations. Limiting visitors is something landlords, again, can do legally under this emergency, but if you need some sort of visitor, like an in-home support, a nursing aid, meal delivery, cleaning service, they can't limit that. You still should have access to your essential services based on your individual needs. We've gotten a lot of calls at Public Justice Center in the past 3 or 4 days. Just, can I move? Is it legal for me to move under the governor's kind of shelter-in-place, stay-home order? And it was a little unclear to me when I read the order. I think you can make an argument either way. Luckily, the governor's official spokesman, Mike Ricci, came out on Twitter today and said, yes, under the governor's interpretation of the executive order, if you were planning to move, you should still be able to move. That's an essential activity. I will say that some landlords are continuing to show the residences to prospective tenants. I don't think that's an essential activity. I've advised my clients to say, no, the landlord can't come into your property just to show the house. That's a significant risk of exposure to COVID, and I don't believe that falls as an essential activity under the executive order. What about homeowners facing foreclosure? What about your landlord facing foreclosure? I'm sure this is going to come up, right? Well, if you don't pay me the rent, I'm going to go into foreclosure and it's going to be awful and you have to pay me now. So there is a federal foreclosure moratorium on some properties. For single family, there's a federal, on federally backed mortgages. So again, these are mortgages owned by FHA, Fannie or Freddie, or essentially insured by the FHA and some other government entities. No foreclosure can move forward until May 18th. It is difficult to find out whether a mortgage is federally backed. It's a little easier if you're the homeowner. You should call your mortgage servicer, but I'll be honest, if you're the tenant in the property, it is going to be a little more difficult to figure out whether or not that your landlord has a federally backed mortgage. There are certain websites online that you can access, and you can do some digging in public records. But in other words, my point is, if you're a homeowner, you should think about taking advantage. Excuse me, you have this moratorium. If you're the tenant and the landlord's telling you they're going into foreclosure, you can say, well, I don't know about that. Let's look into this more. And that's probably even more relevant to the second aspect of assistance for homeowners, landlords, which is mortgage assistance. So the new Federal CARES Act also says that the owners may qualify for forbearance, which is just a deferral of payments. So you don't have to pay it now, but you got to pay it at some point for up to 180 days. Again, this is just on federally backed mortgages. You have to call up the mortgage servicer. You have to ask for the forbearance. Even if you don't have a federally backed mortgage, there are some companies, some service companies that are at least publicly saying that they're going to offer similar relief. And if you're living in a big apartment complex, those multifamily properties with federally backed mortgages are eligible for similar sort of forbearance. So if your landlord tells you they're going into foreclosure, you can say, well, what about forbearance? It's our second word of the day. Again, just, that you're informed that, they may not be facing the imminent loss of property that they may tell you that they're facing. This is just a list of some resources. Amanda spoke before about the Fair Development Solidarity Hotline. I think she's going to talk about that a little bit more later. This is contact information for Sunny and I. Other resources there, and we've gotten a couple questions about the federal stimulus, the payments that folks that make under $75,000 a year are going to receive, and I don't know all the answers to that. There are a lot of good questions out there. The IRS's website actually has some good information. Sunny may know more about that, but I'm just putting it up there for you if you're interested to go explore further. So thank you.
So I'll go ahead and start with some questions. We'll start with a question for Matt. A housing question for you, Matt. If this is a question about rent forgiveness, so while evictions are on pause at the moment, does that mean that after this is all over, rent is going to be forgiven for the time period that evictions were paused?
So under the current laws, no. Essentially, if evictions start again on June 1st, anything that you haven't paid for March, April, and May would be due, and the landlord could file an eviction action if it's not paid. So this is a major, we've never faced anything like this, as I understand it, in the history of the country, and it's mind blowing to think about how many folks. I mean, we're looking at 30% unemployment rate. It's going to be a huge, massive amount of rent that landlords are going to be claiming unless something changes really dramatically in the system.
Thanks, Matt. So we'll head back to that question for Sunny. So how do these, new unemployment laws apply to folks who are back in Maryland after working in another state?
Yeah, so the new laws you should be able to apply through the Maryland system to be eligible for the new laws. For the old laws, you'll have to make a determination whether to file in the state where you used to live or in Maryland. You might have better eligibility, meaning greater benefits in another state. So if you have a base period of eligibility, you've worked for a year in Pennsylvania and recently moved to Maryland, you likely want to apply in Pennsylvania. But for the new benefits, you should be able to apply anywhere.
Thank you, Sunny. Another one for you, Matt. Is there any sort of penalty associated with accepting or using financial assistance via 211?
No, there shouldn't be any penalty. Most landlords are eager to get the payment, right? So they will generally cooperate with you in order to get that rental assistance. Of course, the problem is going to be that we're going to have 60,000 households seeking rental assistance, and if we're lucky with the current federal money, maybe we get $10-15 million in rental assistance. So something has to give, and I think that's why the advocacy that Amanda was talking about is so important, because we have to think of creative ways to change the system so that we're not facing a flood of evictions.
Thank you. For you, Sunny, what proof, if any, do you need to provide if you're choosing not to go to work because of risk of infection to yourself or to a family member?
So in that specific case, you likely would not be able to provide some sort of a proof. If the situation is that a healthcare provider is telling you to quarantine, or they presume you're positive or you have been tested positive, then there's a requirement to get a doctor's note, essentially. But if you're just choosing to stay home, there's no proof that's required. You essentially self-certify.
Thank you. For you, Matt, what kind of late fees will be able to be charged on back rent and on non-payment for utilities after the stay on eviction and court cases is over?
So with respect to back rent, it depends. Right now, in the current laws, it depends on whether or not the landlord has a federally backed mortgage. If they do, they shouldn't be able to charge you late fees. If they don't, they are allowed to charge you late fees. Now, I will say that the landlord industry has essentially put out guidance encouraging its members to negotiate with tenants to waive late fees, to set up payment plans. And so you might find landlords more willing to do that. Again, if you have an agreement, put it in writing, but you might not. So the only folks who have to forego the late fees are those with the federally backed mortgages. And the law is a little different with respect, with multifamily mortgages. If you're living in a big apartment building, even if they have a federally backed mortgage, it may not apply. It gets a little tricky there. With utilities, I'm not entirely sure if BGE could charge you additional late fees if you're behind at this point. That I just don't know. The Office of People's Counsel, if you just Google Office of People's Counsel, they provide some really great consumer tips with respect to utilities.
For you, Sunny, is it likely that someone could be denied unemployment benefits despite the fact that they're out of work due to COVID? And how would someone go about appealing this decision if they were denied unemployment benefits?
So when this crisis started, typically, anytime there's a recession, we're flooded with unemployment cases. That didn't happen or hasn't happened yet. So our suspicion is that they're erring on the side of providing folks with benefits. They're liberally providing unemployment benefits. The other reason might be that they're having a hard time processing all these claims. Last week alone, 82,000 people in Maryland filed for unemployment claims, which is the highest number by far ever in the system. So we're not getting the sense that folks are getting denied. If you do get denied, you do have a right to an appeal. You do have a right to a hearing. You have a right to a notice that says why you were denied, and on that notice, there's explanation of how to appeal. Essentially, you just ask for an appeal in writing. You can handwrite it if you wish, and then there's a telephone hearing that occurs with a hearings examiner, and Maryland Legal Aid can represent you if you qualify for our services.
For you, Matt, do you have any suggestions of any public records that a tenant could look through to help determine whether or not their landlord has a federally backed mortgage?
Yes, there are some websites. I don't think I put those particular websites. If you go to the national, there's one website I put on that PowerPoint, the National Consumer Law Center, and I believe they can direct that. That directs you to the different kind of search engines that are out there to see whether or not someone has a Freddie loan or a Fannie loan or an FHA-backed loan. But I'll get those specific search websites, and we can include that in whatever sort of email gets sent out.
To you, Sunny, what resources are there to support undocumented workers who are out of work at this time?
Right. So unfortunately, I'm sad to say the answer is not a lot. There are a lot of advocacy groups. Legal aid has constraints on what we can and can't do, but there are a lot of advocacy groups that are fighting for undocumented workers. But so far, everything that's passed through the federal legislation has not included them. And there's a lot of categories of folks who are excluded so far. So there are groups out there working for that, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of any at the moment.
For you, Matt, what is the likelihood, in your opinion, of these dates on moratoriums being extended even further into the future?
With respect to evictions, it's an indefinite order right now. There's no set end date. I really don't know. I get different answer from everybody about when this is going to end. So I think when it ends, then the moratorium will certainly end on evictions pretty soon. With respect to the federal kind of different list of dates that I sent out, I don't know that either. I think we're just really on uncharted territory.
For you, Sunny, could you speak a little bit more to, do you know if green card holders risk becoming a public charge if they take advantage of these pandemic unemployment benefits?
Right. So the good news is that unemployment benefits are earned benefits. So there's no risk. There's no public charge assessment for receiving unemployment benefits. These are benefits you've earned by working. So there's no implications for public charge, thankfully.
For you, Matt, can a landlord force a tenant to move out by terminating the lease according to the notice required under the lease, even despite the shelter-in-place order?
Yeah, this is a big, this is a major unknown. So they can't force you to move out, right? You can't be evicted during this time, but could the landlord give you a 30-day notice or a 60-day notice on your end of the year lease or your month-to-month lease? That's a really tough question. If you're facing that issue, I suggest you give us a call. I think we want to figure out whether or not you have a federally backed mortgage on the property, and then we would look a little more closely at the new federal law to see if there's a defense there. It's really that's a really tough one.
For you, Sunny, if someone is working 2 jobs to get by and they lose one job but are still employed in the other one, will they still be able to apply for these unemployment benefits?
Yes, short answer, yes. You should be able to apply. Essentially, you may only be eligible for partial benefits, so you would not get the maximum or the full amount if you had no job. But yes, you should definitely apply, and you likely will get partial benefits, but there's a lot of variables, so it depends.
For you, Matt, there's a tenant who is trying to find someplace new to live by June 1st, and they're wondering what obligations their new landlord would have to ensure that their new rental is clean and safe.
Well, I think, if they've signed a lease, then the lease obligates the landlord to provide that clean and safe rental as of June 1st. Now, if they know that there's currently other tenants in that property, as a practical matter, the landlord can't right now evict those other tenants. And so they should be very realistic about about what's going to happen if those other tenants are not planning on leaving. So I would suggest that they really communicate with the landlord as much as possible, get those communications in writing, and just from a practical perspective, try to figure out what's going to happen and whether or not that apartment really is going to be ready.
For you, Sunny, it sounds like the form online does not currently allow independent contractors to apply for unemployment. Do you have an estimate of when independent contractors will be able to apply for unemployment online?
So the estimates that we've heard are roughly 2 weeks. That seems ambitious to us. The federal government has passed legislation that allows for money for the states to implement changes to their system. Now, anyone familiar with how federal legislation works, all that takes time. There's guidance that needs to be issued, the money needs, systems that need to be developed. They're telling us 2 weeks. If they are able to accomplish that, that'd be very impressive, and I'd be very happy. My suspicion is it's going to take a bit longer. On the Department of Labor's website, Maryland Department of Labor's website, there is a link to provide your email address, and they will email you when that system is ready. So yeah, currently the benefits that are been expanded under the CARES Act are not available nationwide. No one's able to apply for them right now. So they're actually asking folks to hold off on applying. You will get all the benefits you're entitled to when the system goes online, but we're hoping in 2 weeks.
For you, Matt, do you know if any of the eviction moratoriums or other resources are also available to commercial renters?
So the eviction moratorium is not applicable in Maryland to commercial properties. Having said that, the courts are generally closed at the moment to hearing non-emergency cases. So in other words, if the landlord of a commercial property went in and filed a complaint for eviction, that the tenant of the commercial property is still entitled to a hearing and a trial, and right now those matters are not being heard. So there are two different things, right? There's the courts being closed to non-emergency matters essentially, and then there's also this eviction moratorium on residential properties. And so right now, the landlord cannot evict that commercial tenant or not initiate a new eviction action until the courts reopen for non-emergency matters.
Thank you. A couple more questions for Sunny here. Would self-employed workers who are the sole proprietors of their business, which is a non-LLC, qualify for the PUA?
Yes. Those types of claimants are specifically listed as eligible for the PUA. That's essentially those types of folks who would never be eligible under traditional UI would be eligible under the PUA.
Another question for you, Sunny. Is there any information for when people who receive SSI will get the stimulus payments? Will that be an automatic thing, or will they have to file something?
Yeah, so I'm glad someone asked that question. I didn't include this material in my presentation, but I'm happy to go over it a little bit more. So the stimulus payment or economic payment, they're calling it a bunch of different things, but essentially, probably for everybody on this call and majority of folks, if for an individual, the payment is $1,200. For a couple, it's $2,400. It's $500 for each dependent under 17. It's unclear exactly how the payments will go out. What is clear is if you filed the 2019 tax and if you provided direct deposit information to the IRS, they're saying you'll get the benefits in 3 weeks. If you didn't file a 2019 tax, they'll go to look for 2018 taxes. If you didn't provide direct deposit information, they'll likely mail you a check. There's supposed to be a website set up by the IRS that you can update your direct deposit information or perhaps your address. They haven't issued guidance on that yet. Initially, they had also said that all Social Security recipients will have to file a simple tax form in order to get the benefit. As of 7 p.m. yesterday, they've walked that back a bit. So if you are getting Social Security retirement benefits or Social Security disability benefits, SSDI, then they will use your SSA 1099 form to pull your information and automatically send you the benefits. So that leaves a lot of folks who are not covered. So SSI recipients, VA pension beneficiaries. Those folks, as it stands, will have to file a simple tax form. How simple is this tax form? We don't know. How will folks without computer access, or all the tax sites are closed because of the pandemic? How will they be able to file these? It's unclear. So there's a lot of advocacy groups trying to get that changed. There's no reason why anybody who's already receiving government benefits, in my opinion, should have to file anything. As far as I'm concerned, the government already has their information and sends the money already. So adding more shouldn't be a problem. So all these questions we're waiting for guidance on.
A couple more for you, Sunny. Is there any sort of support or resources that are available for folks who are working in underground economy trades, such as the drug or sex trades, or who are working under the table?
So the biggest resource at this point will be this stimulus money. It's a one-time payment, unfortunately, but at this point, that's probably the biggest one. Even if folks have no income, zero income, they should still be eligible for this benefit. We've heard that if you file a tax form with zero income, it gets rejected. So they ask usually that you put a dollar amount, like $1 is fine. It's even simpler than easy 1040 or whatever the easy form is for taxes. So that's, at this point, that's probably the biggest resource for folks.
And would independent contractors be able to get back unemployment funds for the duration of time that they've been out of work and waiting for the state to make updates to the application so that they can actually apply?
Yes, so it doesn't matter when you apply, they will backdate it to when you became unemployed, essentially. So yes, 39 weeks of benefits, and you'll be entitled to all of that if you're employed for the entirety of that. The one thing I will say is, I mentioned that the work search requirements have been suspended, but they're still requiring folks to file certifications. It's usually you can call in or go on their website. You're supposed to certify that you looked for jobs. I'm not sure what you'll be certifying now, but there's still this requirement that you have to certify, even though they're not expecting you to look for work.
If people are already receiving unemployment benefits, do they need to reapply to receive any sort of the extended benefits, or will these be added automatically?
Right, so there's three different benefits. The $600, that will be automatically added. The additional 13 weeks, you'll automatically, after the 26 weeks expires, you'll automatically be enrolled for an additional 13 weeks. For the PUA, you likely will have to reapply, especially if it's unclear. I shouldn't say you would have to reapply. It's unclear. My sense is you will have to reapply. Ideally, the way it should work is you get the traditional 26 weeks, you get an additional 13 weeks, and then you automatically get enrolled in PUA. We'll wait and see if that's how it works in practice.
And do you have any estimates of when the federal funding will be available for unemployment?
So that is supposed to be immediately is the answer. The law is already in effect. Practically speaking, I'm not sure, but yeah, the CARES Act went into effect April 1st, and the Families First Act even earlier. So yeah, it's just a matter of getting the money out. I don't know how long that takes.
And then these are more general questions. So either Matt or Sunny, whoever can take them would be great. This one is about paid time off. So if someone thinks that they're sick, or if they're caring for someone who is sick, are they protected by federal law to be able to take paid time off? And if so, for how long?
So I can take that. So under the CARES Act, they've expanded they've created paid sick leave, essentially. So for folks who have to stay at home for a COVID-19 reason, and there's specific reasons, but generally speaking, if you have to stay at home for a COVID-19 reason, you're entitled to 10 days or 80 hours of paid leave. In addition to that, if you have to stay at home because your child's school has closed for a COVID-19 reason, you're entitled to 10 more weeks of FMLA at 66% rate of pay. And there's caps on that, but the caps are fairly high. So this is a new benefit. If you're already getting sick leave through your employer, this is an additional benefit on top of that for a COVID-19 related reason.
Another more general question. Do existing laws regarding language access still apply under emergency orders? So for example, if someone needs an interpreter to call the police or a publicly funded hospital or the school principal, are they still entitled to receive interpretation or translation?
I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead. No, go.
I would argue yes. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything that would suspend the laws around language access during this time. And before I forget, I just want to go back to one thing. I said earlier that commercial tenants can't be evicted. And I'm remembering now that the laws are a little different with respect to commercial tenancies. Sorry, I said that they couldn't be evicted if they hadn't already got an eviction order from the court because the courts are closed. In Maryland, there is a right for the owner of a property to do a self-help eviction for commercial tenants. It gets a little bit complicated, but essentially they don't have to have a court order in some circumstances to do a self-help eviction for commercial tenants. So if you are in a commercial tenancy and you're really concerned about that, the laws are a little bit different. I'm not an expert on commercial tenancies, and you should really seek other counsel.
A question for you, Matt. So if someone is asking for rent amnesty or forgiveness from their landlord, should they be including their water bill in that request?
I mean, if the water bill is due to the landlord, then absolutely they should make sure that any sort of payment plan or agreement they come up with covers any sort of obligation that they owe the landlord.